It didn't just leak, it detonated. A quiet document, buried in official channels, suddenly exploded across the world, and in one brutal stroke, King Charles III didn't just make a decision, he drew a line in royal blood. The question that refused to die, what would happen to Archie and Lilibet, has finally been answered. And the answer isn't gentle, it isn't diplomatic, it isn't even negotiable. It's final. A cold, calculated no that echoes through Buckingham Palace like a door slamming shut forever. Because this was never just about titles. It was about power, control, and a monarchy that decided it was done playing nice. Behind the scenes, while headlines speculated and interviews stirred sympathy, something far more precise was unfolding. The machinery of the British state, the Privy Council, the Cabinet Office, wasn't reacting emotionally. It was building a case, quietly, patiently, methodically. And when it was ready, it didn't argue, it acted. What makes this moment unsettling is not just the outcome, it's the logic behind it. The palace didn't say Archie and Lilibet can't be royals. It said they don't qualify. That distinction, that's everything. Because suddenly, royalty isn't blood anymore, it's a role, a job, a contract with conditions. And if you don't show up, you don't get to wear the crown. Now ask yourself, who decided to test that rule? Because this isn't happening in isolation. Every move traces back to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Every step away from the UK, every deal signed in California, every carefully crafted brand moment, it all built toward this exact confrontation. They didn't just leave the system, they tried to redefine it. And the system didn't bend, it snapped back. The palace's message is almost chilling in its simplicity. Titles are not souvenirs. They are not decorations to carry across oceans and attach to lifestyle brands. They are tied to service, to presence, to loyalty. And if you strip those away, what's left? Nothing official, nothing recognized, nothing protected. And suddenly, the Montecito dream starts to look less like freedom and more like exile. Because here's where the story gets sharper. The crown didn't just deny titles, it closed doors. Real ones, diplomatic ones, legal ones, even symbolic ones. Names removed from registers, honors quietly erased, protections withdrawn. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. The silence did the work. Meanwhile, across the ocean, another narrative was being built. Deals, brands, influence. But here's the uncomfortable question no one wanted to ask out loud. Can you really build a global empire using a royal identity if the crown itself refuses to recognize it? That's the contradiction at the heart of this storm. Because while Harry and Meghan position themselves as modern royals, independent, global, untethered, the institution they came from was rewriting the rules in real time, and not in their favor. And then there's Prince William, watching, calculating, not reacting publicly, but shaping the future behind the curtain. Because this isn't just about today, it's about what happens when he becomes king, and whether there's room for a parallel monarchy operating from another continent. The answer now seems obvious. There isn't. But what makes this situation even more intense is the emotional illusion that surrounded it. For years, it felt like a family drama, a personal fallout, a clash of personalities. But what this decision reveals is something far colder. This was never about feelings, it was about structure, about survival, about an institution that has outlived centuries and knows exactly how to protect itself. So when the palace says no, it doesn't whisper, it writes it into history. And the consequences, they don't just hit headlines, they reshape identities, futures, legacies. Because now a question lingers in the air, one that no official statement will answer. If titles can be withheld, if recognition can be removed, if the monarchy can redraw its own boundaries, then what else is still on the table? And more importantly, was this the end of the story, or just the moment everything finally became irreversible? And just when it seemed like the storm had reached its peak, something even more unsettling began to unfold. Not louder, not dramatic, but quieter, more deliberate, more permanent. Because what happened next wasn't about announcements, it was about erasure. The kind that doesn't trend, doesn't explode, but rewrites reality piece by piece until there's nothing left to argue about. Inside the guarded corridors of Buckingham Palace, the process had already begun. Names weren't shouted out, they were quietly adjusted, records weren't destroyed, they were corrected. And in those corrections, something chilling appeared. Archie and Lilibet were no longer framed as future figures of the crown, but simply as the children of Prince Harry. No embellishment, no elevation, just a factual line stripped of everything that once gave it weight. And if you think that's symbolic, think again, because in royal protocol, symbols are power. A missing title isn't a detail, it's a declaration. It tells diplomats how to address you. It tells governments how to treat you. It tells the world whether you matter inside inside the system or outside of it. And suddenly, the shift wasn't theoretical anymore. It was operational. Foreign offices updated their internal guidance. Diplomatic circles adjusted their expectations. Security protocols, the invisible shield that follows royal blood, were recalculated, not removed out of spite, but simply not granted. Because the palace didn't need to punish. It only needed to redefine. And that redefinition hit harder than any public statement ever could. Because for years, there was an assumption, almost a belief, that royal status was untouchable, that once you were born into it, it stayed with you, no matter where you lived, no matter what you did. But what 2026 quietly proved is that assumption was wrong, completely wrong. Royalty, it turns out, is conditional, and the conditions were never meant to be ignored. This is where the story stops feeling like gossip and starts feeling like strategy, because behind every move, there's a pattern, a system tightening itself, a monarchy reshaping its future not around emotion, but around control. And at the center of that shift stands King Charles III, not as a conflicted grandfather, but as a sovereign drawing boundaries that even blood cannot cross. The message he delivered privately but powerfully echoes through everything that followed. The monarchy does not provide privileges to those who stand outside it. And that one sentence quietly dismantled years of expectation. Because if you look closely, every path that once led back into the royal fold has been blocked. Not slammed shut in anger, but sealed with logic. Legal logic. Constitutional logic. The kind that doesn't argue. It simply exists. Take the question of identity. Not emotional identity, but institutional identity. For the crown, being royal isn't about who your parents are. It's about where you stand, where you live, what you represent. And right now, Archie and Lilibet stand outside that frame. Raised in California, educated in a completely different system, immersed in a culture that celebrates individuality over duty. None of this is wrong in itself, but in the eyes of the monarchy, it creates a gap, a distance that cannot be ignored. Because how can someone represent an institution they are not part of? That question doesn't need to be answered publicly. The palace already answered it quietly by moving forward without them. And then comes the most uncomfortable layer of all, the one nobody wants to say out loud, the commercial angle. Because while the crown was tightening its structure, something else was happening across the ocean. Brands were forming, identities were being shaped, and at times those identities brushed dangerously close to the very titles the palace was trying to protect. That's where the tension truly ignited. Because for the monarchy, the idea of royal status being used even indirectly as a marketing tool isn't just controversial, it's unacceptable. It threatens the one thing the institution relies on above all else, its perceived integrity. And once that is questioned, everything becomes fragile. So the response wasn't emotional, it was defensive, strategic. A line drawn not just around titles, but around what those titles can and cannot be connected to. And this is where the story starts to feel less like a family conflict and more like a silent standoff between two completely different worlds. One built on centuries of tradition, duty, and controlled image. The other built on modern influence, branding, and personal narrative. And here's the truth that sits right in the middle of that clash. Only one of those worlds has the power to define what royal actually means. Now shift your focus back to Prince William, because this is where his role becomes impossible to ignore. He isn't reacting to the situation. He's preparing for what comes next, for a reign that cannot afford ambiguity, for a monarchy that cannot survive confusion about who is inside and who is out. And so, the distance we're seeing now, it's not temporary, it's foundational. Because if this moment proves anything, it's that the crown isn't interested in compromise anymore. Not partial roles, not hybrid identities, not part-time royals navigating between continents. That era is over. What remains is something much sharper, much clearer, and for some, much colder. A system where presence equals legitimacy, where duty defines identity, where stepping away doesn't just create space, it creates absence. And absence, once established at this level, is almost impossible to reverse, which leaves one final lingering question hanging in the air, one that doesn't come with an official answer but feels heavier than everything else combined. If the doors of Buckingham Palace aren't just closed but structurally sealed, then what does the future actually look like for those standing on the outside? Not next year, not in the next headline, but decades from now. Because history doesn't forget decisions like this, it builds around them. And right now, it's already moving on.